Okay, thank you everyone for being here. We are happy to see everyone here for another Metrics of Regulation webinar. And we are here mostly to shed a light on new methodologies in the study of regulation and to push the field forward by asking new questions and exploring new avenues for research. So far, we've discussed various measures of regulation across different aspects and dimensions, but we haven't yet explored public perceptions and specifically sentiments about regulation. And for this reason, we have here today Zoey Shi. We are happy to have you here to address this important topic in the US context. And I will introduce now Zoey very briefly, and then she will start her presentation. So Zoe is a senior policy analyst at the George Washington Regulatory Studies Center and a PhD candidate in economics at the George Washington University. Her research interests include macroeconomics, regulation, innovation, field dynamics, and economic growth. Her recent research focuses on the economic effects of regulation using natural language processing techniques and Texas data. Zoe's research has been published in leading economics, public policy, and public administration journals. And I think at this point we can start Zoe's presentation. So please, Zoe, the floor is yours. Good luck.
Thank you, Nir, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar. And so let me start share my screen. Okay, I also want to make sure that I can see. Sorry. Somehow I can't see the Zoom. But can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Oh, sorry.
Not yet. It will.
Okay.
It will work in a minute.
Okay.
Now it starts.
Okay. How about this?
Yes.
Excellent.
All right. Okay. So yeah, as Nir mentioned, my presentation today will focus on sentiment and uncertainty about regulation. And this is measures from the joint work with Tara Sinclair, who is a professor of economics at the George Washington University. And so I'd like to kind of motivate this presentation by a couple of newspaper quotes. So in the first quote, during the election week in 2020, a Wall Street Journal article reported that US stocks surged as investors cheered the prospect of curbs on new regulations under a split Congress. So now here note the phrase, the prospect of curbs on new regulations. So it kind of indicates forward-looking information. So this is not about how much regulation was actually cut, but about how investors think the regulatory regime is going to change. And they, as well as the market, reacted to that. And in the second quote here, it's about regulatory uncertainty in the drug approval process, saying that it would undercut drug development and investment, chill innovation, and compromise patient health. So regulatory uncertainty might be a more familiar phrase to many people. It means how much people don't know what will happen in the regulatory regime. So from these quotes, both how people think things will go and how unsure they are about it reflect subjective perception of regulation. So like these news articles highlighted, many economic activities are subject to this type of subjective perception. And this motivated us to measure subjective perception of regulation and specifically the sentiment and uncertainty about the regulatory environment. So in this paper, we focus on the US context, the US regulatory environment, and we constructed the measures using natural language processing techniques to analyze the text of relevant news articles. So just to give you a preview of these measures, so our primary data is newspaper text. So using newspapers to construct the measures has a couple of advantages. So first, news content often contains forward-looking information, so it can capture, how people think about the future regulatory environment. And the second, news is typically published at least on a daily basis. So it contains high frequency information. So that would allow us to create high frequency measures that reflect real-time fluctuations in sentiment or uncertainty, and could be, used in many like high frequency economic analysis. As I mentioned, the main method we used is a natural language processing method, which I will talk in more detail in a few slides. And our output includes two sets of measures. The first set is monthly indexes of aggregate sentiment and uncertainty about the regulatory environment. And the second set of measures also includes those regulatory sentiment and regulatory uncertainty indexes for 14 different regulatory policy areas. And these measures are also on a monthly frequency. And both sets of measures span the time period from 1985 to 2021. And this is an overview of the workflow of how we constructed the measure. So we started with initial news corpus, which is from major US newspapers based on simple keyword search. So to identify regulation related news content from this news corpus, we relied on the titles of rules considered by federal agencies. So we used natural language processing to extract all non-trunks from the rule titles. So you can understand the non-trunks as subsets of noun phrases. And we then match the non-trunks with the news articles in the initial news corpus to determine whether an article contains regulation-related content. And we then use a natural language processing method called sentiment analysis to assess two dimensions of perception in the regulation-related news content. And that is the first is the average sentiment, how positive or negative it is. And the second is the level of uncertainty expressed. And using the estimates from the sentiment analysis, we constructed monthly sentiment and uncertainty indexes. So these are our aggregate indexes. So in addition to the aggregate indexes, we further categorized the news content into different policy areas and built categorical sentiment and uncertainty indexes. So to do that, we first categorized all the regulatory non-trunks that occurred in the news corpus into 14 policy areas. And next, we categorized the regulation-related news articles based on what non-trunks it contains. And combining it with the sentiment analysis results, we built the categorical indexes for these for each policy area. So I will talk about like each step in more detail in the next 30 minutes or so. So our initial news corpus includes the full text of over 1 million news articles that contain the keywords starting with regulate or deregulate. So for example, regulation, regulator, and deregulation are all included. And those articles are from 7 US newspapers published between January 1985 and December 2021. So these newspapers are listed in this table. And from the initial corpus, we removed duplicated articles and eventually identified approximately 600,000 articles that contain regulation-related content. And so I will talk about how we identified those, the regulation-related content. So in the initial corpus, although all the articles contain the word regulation or its variants, a problem with this corpus is that it includes some false positives. So here are two examples showing sentences that both mention the word regulation. We would want to identify the first case on the top here, which refers to seatbelt regulation. It's government regulation, regulatory policy. But the initial corpus also included cases like the one at the bottom here, which includes the word regulation, but actually talks about a sport game. So therefore, in this way, like a simple keyword search could not really give us a clean corpus related to regulation. So how can we determine whether a sentence mentioning the word regulation actually refers to government regulatory policy or something else? We can think a little bit about how a human would do that when reading these. A human would probably look at the context in which the word regulation is mentioned. And in this context, the human could look for keywords that might indicate relevance to government regulations. So this is exactly what we did in this process. So first, we identify every sentence that mentions keywords regulation or its variants. And let's call these sentences, this sentence as a regulatory sentence, indexed I. And then okay, I'll continue. Yeah, and in the second example, we didn't see any relevant terms like that. So we can determine that the first example is most likely referring to government regulations instead of anything else. And so first let's call these three consecutive sentences as a regulatory section, since we have determined that they are related to government regulations. So the objective now is to identify all regulatory sections from the newspaper, from all the news articles in our initial corpus. So the question is how we can automate this process and apply it to a large amount of text. We defined keywords related to regulation by examining titles of all rules considered by federal agencies. This data is from the Unified Agenda published between 1995 and 2019. And we used natural language processing algorithm to extract non-trunks from these rule titles. So we can look at an example of EPA rule, the rule issued by Environmental Protection Agency here. So in this rule title, the non-trunks include test procedure analysis, trace metal, and Clean Water Act. We only keep the non-trunks with 2 or more tokens because a single token non-trunk like analysis here is too broad. And in this way, we identified nearly 30,000 unique and token non-trunks from all rule titles. And we then searched through the potential regulatory sections in the initial news corpus for those regulatory non-trunks. And again, in this example, the terms human service, head start, and seatbelt are all non-trunks from rule titles. In other words, if a set of 3 consecutive sentences contain 1 or more regulatory non-trunks like this, we define those sentences as a regulatory section. And then finally, we conducted some human checking and correction of the non-trunks that occurred in all the articles to remove some general terms. As a result, we ended up with around 10,000 unique regulatory non-trunks that occurred in over like 600,000 news articles. And we use these we use the regulatory sections in these news articles for our sentiment analysis later. But before we go into the sentiment analysis, we can first see how news attention to regulation has changed over time. And we can see that using the identified regulation-related content. So this figure shows a normalized index of the monthly volume of news articles related to regulation, adjusted for the total number of articles published in a newspaper in a month. And clearly, there is a somewhat increasing trend in news attention to regulation, especially after the 2007 to 2008 financial crisis. And we see large spikes or drops in the index capturing important historical events such as the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy, the passage of Obamacare, the Dodd-Frank Act, and the presidential elections. So this increasing attention to regulation further motivated us to investigate the content of regulation-related news. So to measure the sentiment and the uncertainty expressed in the relevant news articles, we use a lexicon-based sentiment analysis approach. So sentiment analysis is a natural language processing method, which is most frequently used to assess the positive or negative sentiment of a document. However, it can also be used to assess other types of subjective information, such as emotions, confidence, and uncertainty. The lexicon-based approach relies on predefined dictionaries of opinionated words. In our baseline analysis, we used the Lagrange and MacDonald dictionary, which includes lists of negative words, positive words, and words that express uncertainty and imprecision. So based on how many positive and negative words occurred in the regulatory section of a news article, we calculated the sentiment score for each article as a difference in the proportions of positive and negative words in the regulatory section. And because sentiment score can be affected by the balance of positive and negative words defined in a dictionary, we also used two other dictionaries to assess sentiment as robustness checks, including the Harvard GI Dictionary and the Lexicoder Sentiment Dictionary, the LSD. And for uncertainty, we used LM dictionary to identify the uncertainty words in a regulatory section, and the uncertainty score for the article is basically the proportion of uncertainty words in the regulatory section. So the idea of lexicon-based sentiment analysis is quite straightforward, but I just wanted to show a couple of examples to make that clear. So this is a regulatory section from a Wall Street Journal article from our corpus. So based on the sentiment words defined in the LM dictionary, there are 2 negative words and 3 positive words in this section. The 2 negative words are hazards, violation, and the positive words are boosted, without fear, and boost. So that resulted in a slightly positive sentiment score for this article. And the second regulatory section contains 4 uncertainty words as defined in the LM dictionary, including confusion, preliminary, vagueness, and confusing. So that resulted in a relatively high uncertainty score for this article. But for our purpose, instead of absolute sentiment or uncertainty scores, we are more interested in changes in the regulatory sentiment and the regulatory uncertainty over time. So to estimate that, we followed Shapiro et al. 2020 paper to use a fixed effects regression. So in this regression, on the left-hand side, we have the estimated sentiment or uncertainty score for each article. On the right-hand side, we we have the year-month fixed effects and the newspaper fixed effects. So the newspaper fixed effects can address the potential concern of ideological divergences among news sources. And the estimated monthly sentiment or uncertainty index is basically the estimated coefficients on the year-month fixed effects from this regression. And this figure shows the standardized regulatory sentiment indexes estimated using those three different dictionaries. So you can see that there are some variations in the three indexes, but they generally suggest very similar overall patterns in regulatory sentiment over time. And the correlations between those indexes are also very high, especially with the LM and the LSD sentiment indexes correlated at 0.8. And the first principal component of these three sentiment indexes explains like 80% of the variance. So this indicates that the index is not very sensitive to the choice of sentiment dictionaries. And this figure plots the regulatory uncertainty index. And we can see that in particular, there are more spikes in regulatory uncertainty during more recent years, including months around the 2016 presidential election and the coronavirus outbreak. And we further checked the validity of our measures in several ways. And one thing we did is to examine whether large sentiment or uncertainty fluctuations are associated with relevant events. You've already seen some events annotated in the figures, but we further looked at the word clouds of regulatory sections in the news articles published in the months with large changes in regulatory sentiment or regulatory uncertainty. So for example, these top three word clouds shows the news content published in the months with negative sentiment shocks. So for example, the reduction in regulatory sentiment in April 2010 is related to post-crisis financial regulation, and as demonstrated by these keywords here in the word cloud. And in July 2012, the controversy around LIBOR rates caused another substantial decrease in regulatory sentiment. And these bottom three word clouds are from the news articles published in the months with increased regulatory uncertainty. And in September 2008, it was announced that Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae were being placed under the direct supervision of the federal government, which triggered an increase in regulatory uncertainty. And in April 2020, the coronavirus outbreak was associated with another regulatory uncertainty spike. And this also helps us interpret the regulatory sentiment and the regulatory uncertainty measures. As you see from these word clouds and the events annotated in the figures before, fluctuations in the subjective perception of regulation are not only caused by more or less regulations, but also various types of regulatory events, such as the promulgation of a new regulation accompanies regulatory compliance or violation, a lawsuit challenging maybe agency actions, and even maybe the president's Twitter about a potential regulatory action. And these all types of regulatory events could drive public perception of the regulatory environment. So as I have mentioned, we constructed the categorical indexes as well. So we classified those regulation-related news articles into different policy areas. So based on the regulatory non-trunks that occurred in a regulatory section, we trace back to the agency that issued the rules with titles containing the non-trunks, and then define the policy area for the regulatory section based on the authority of the agency. So in the example here, we classify this regulatory section into transportation regulation based on the non-trunk seatbelt and airbag. So basically, we trace back to the rule titles that contain these non-trunks, and the agency that issued this rule was the Department of Transportation. So we could classify this regulatory section into transportation regulation. And in using this approach, we classified all the articles into 14 different regulatory policy areas. And as shown in this bar graph here, the most common regulatory area in our news corpus is finance and banking regulation, followed by consumer safety and health, environmental and natural resources, and general business and trade. So using the news content classified into each policy area, we used the same fixed effects regressions to estimate categorical regulatory sentiment and the regulatory uncertainty indexes for each area. And since financial and banking regulation is the most prevalent topic in the news corpus, we can take a closer look at its sentiment and uncertainty. So this figure shows the regulatory sentiment specifically around financial and banking regulation. There are several drops in sentiment during this time period. The biggest drop occurred in the late 80s and early 90s. This coincides with the savings and the loan crisis. And sentiment also declined during the periods associated with, Fannie Mae's violation of accounting rules in 2004, the LIBOR scandal in 2012, and the coronavirus outbreak in 2020. So, another interesting observation from this is that the sentiment did not experience significant reductions during the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis, as you see here. And in contrast, regulatory uncertainty increased substantially starting the financial crisis and reached a peak in 2010 as the Dodd-Frank Act was passed in response to the crisis. So these contrasting patterns suggest that our measures do not capture a perception of the market, but more of the regulatory environment concerning the market. So although uncertainty is usually perceived negatively, but comparing these two measures indicate that higher uncertainty is not always accompanied by more negative sentiment. An example is the 2016 presidential election. So this election is associated with a spike in both regulatory uncertainty and the regulatory sentiment, as you can see here. This is the sentiment and this is the uncertainty. And those changes are likely to reflect, positive yet uncertain prospects for the curbs on financial regulations as claimed during President Trump's first presidential campaign in 2016. So at the end, I just would like to mention to talk about the economic implications of regulatory sentiment and the regulatory uncertainty. There have been a handful of studies examining the aggregate and cumulative economic costs of regulation. And they tend to focus on volume or restriction of regulation. So for example, studies have used page counts, word counts, and restrictive word counts in the Code of Federal Regulations or the Federal Register as a measure of regulation. And those measures contain valuable information to help us understand the size of the regulatory stock or regulatory flow and can be used to study the economic impact of regulation. However, I always think that the size of regulation is not the whole story. As we saw from the news quotes in the beginning, market participants react to how they feel about the current and or future regulatory environment. So, for example, when firms perceive negatively or become uncertain about a change in the regulatory environment, they may withdraw or even they may postpone or even withdraw their hiring and investment activities. So I think a major message we want to convey from this paper is that subjective perception matters. And this actually has been widely demonstrated in the literature studying economic sentiment or policy uncertainty. There have been multiple measures of economic sentiment, such as survey-based Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, as well as other news-based economic sentiment index. And also a relatively new literature focuses on news-based policy uncertainty measures. A seminal work in this literature is the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index, constructed by Baker et al. 2016. However, there had been no existing measures of perception of the overall regulatory environment like our measures. In our paper, we also used our measures to examine how regulatory sentiment and regulatory uncertainty relates to macroeconomic outcomes. Since this presentation is focusing on the metrics of regulation, I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but basically our main findings are that a regulatory sentiment shock, basically, the unexpected negative news about regulation is associated with significant and persistent drops in aggregate output and employment. And this effect is most prominent in the areas of transportation regulation and health and safety regulation. And for uncertainty, we did not find a significant relationship between aggregate regulatory uncertainty and economic indicators. However, uncertainty around certain areas, such as energy regulation, seems to matter. So kind of building on that, I have another paper measuring regulatory uncertainty specifically around oil and gas production, and find that increased uncertainty leads to declines in oil production as well as aggregate output. Yeah, and while in this paper, we focused on the macroeconomic effects of regulatory sentiment and the regulatory uncertainty, but these measures, can be basically applied to many different contexts and can be used in different studies that to examine how regulatory sentiment or different subjective perceptions of regulation can affect different outcomes. Yep, that's basically my presentation, and thank you for your attention, and looking forward to any comments or questions.
Thank you very much, Zoe, for this excellent presentation and a very interesting one. Let's start the Q&A, and anyone want to ask a question or to give a feedback, please do it. Or raise your hand.
Let me start in saying that thank you. This is a very impressive work.
Thank you.
It's amazingly so, and I'm very impressed. The effort, the analysis, the measure is very, very impressive. But on the other end, the analysis, the conclusions that you draw got a little attention. Maybe it's, you didn't develop the conclusions. This is what I mean. Maybe because we are focusing here on the metrics of regulation and not the implications But more generally, I would love to hear you connecting your analysis to the chaos. Say, let's start with the chaos because it's so relevant. I would call it the Trump administration, second Trump administration is chaotic reform, a take on the institution of the American state. I don't know if you agree, but there is something there. And I'm very, very interested to hear you connect sentiment analysis and uncertainty analysis to what we see here. This is my first question among so many, but I see also Zhoudan is raising her hand, but so I will stay on one and let you the opportunity to answer first.
Yeah, I think it will be very interesting to, we haven't updated our indexes recently, but it would be very interesting to see how, the regulatory sentiment and the regulatory uncertainty changed recently in response to the recent like political or like government movements. And I since I don't have the data now, but I would speculate that we could probably see an elevated level of regulatory uncertainty during the recent months, especially since we have those 14 policy areas. One of the areas is government operations. So it basically captures rules published by OPM, like OMB, and other like agencies relevant like governing the government operations. We would probably see a more like heightened uncertainty or uncertainty level in that policy area. It's hard to, guess how the sentiment would look like during the recent months because different, basically different people have different views about the recent developments, and our index tend to capture the average, the most prevailing sentiment expressed in the news. So without actually looking into the data and constructing the measure, I think I would not say too much about the sentiment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Could I jump in just with my thoughts on this same point as well, is that it could be the case, as Zoe highlighted at the end, that it isn't about, so I think it's pretty clear that uncertainty has risen, but whether that's going to have a negative or positive macroeconomic impact depends on how the sentiment moves as well. And so one thing that we have seen is, as Zoe highlighted, more conflicting views in terms of the sentiment. And so that might be why we're not necessarily seeing the macroeconomic data shifting along with the rising uncertainty, at least not yet.
Okay, Susan, please. We don't hear you. Please unmute yourself. Thanks.
Thanks. Nice to meet you, Zoe, and thank you, Zoe and Tara, for your thoughtful paper. To me, though, like it reminds me of some work I've done with Google Analytics, where, as you described it as the average, whereas I describe it as the median, and you don't see it unless there's, the jump can be 7 people commenting, or it can be 3 million people commenting, and I worry about that in terms of really coming up with a proxy that measures what's happening here. The other thing is, I regret I haven't read your paper yet. Tara sent it to me, and I can't wait to read it. But to some extent, this is an attempt, to me, to come up with some sort of measure of trust in governance, right? And yet you do this dance around that instead of acknowledging that. And so I guess, I don't know if you saw the Washington Post, sorry for going off on a tangent, but I think it was today's Post had an article, or it might be the Times, I'll send it to you, about what is being lost with Dodge. And that is trust in governance, right? The willingness, the belief that a government actor, whether it is an agency or it is an individual working for that agency, is trying to do their best to provide services or whatever. And it just seems to me, why not address that directly? Why not try to be more direct about what you're really measuring here? Which is, you know, because if I think scholars really need to know what is happening. Are we losing that glue that allows us to believe that governments and policymakers are acting in our best interest? What do you think?
Yeah, I would say, well, first of all, thank you for your comment. I think a measure of trust in government or in policy in general could be is a great idea. It could be another interesting paper. I mean, I would think, I mean, in some sense, sentiment would actually capture some of that, but not all of that, because we are capturing, sentiment about the kind of the regulatory environment as a whole, not only like what's happening in the government, but this would be the trust measure would be a more specific element in the sentiment, and we probably need to further refine the news corpus we study as well as the sentiment dictionaries we choose. But that could be a very interesting paper, I would say.
Yeah, please, more comments, questions?
Yeah, I can go on unless there are others first. If none, I will ask, to what extent the data on public perception of regulation, meaning Gallup data that goes back even earlier to the 70s, sometimes to the 60s, is comparable to what you did. Maybe the data, maybe the data on public opinions make the content analysis less useful, less rewarding. So why not use public opinion, or Susan said trust, rather than sentiment and uncertainty? What are the cost and benefits of each of the measures?
Yeah. I think there are at least two reasons that we want to use, like newspapers to construct these measures. First is that those survey-based measures are limited in their scope. I mean, they couldn't really survey the entire population in the US. So their sample size is usually limited in certain sites. And also the second reason is that, as I have mentioned in the presentation, news articles, news sources have its advantage by providing high frequency information. It's published daily. I mean, if you have the resources and time, you could update the indexes literally daily to reflect the real-time fluctuations in the sentiment or uncertainty or any other measures. So these are I think the most prominent advantages of using like newspaper as data compared to those survey-based measures.
But Zoe, if I
Yes.
may,
Sure.
But survey data represents an attempt to come up with a representative sample, right?
Yeah,
and
that's
you
true.
have no evidence that what you're getting is in all representative of what people really think. And, I mean, all people I mean, like, to me, also surveys can be manipulated, right? There's lots of problems with surveys, no doubt. Why not compare the survey data, which I would describe as, you could call one supply side and one demand side, right? In a sense, reflecting the source of the questions. But I guess, like, I want desperately, as Tara knows, to come up with new metrics of trust. Because, my work looks at trust in governance from a different angle as it evolves, as technology evolves, right? And like you're getting there.
Yeah, that's definitely an idea we can explore more, and I'd love to talk with you offline more about this. Yeah, I mean, if there is if you can think of any comparable measure based on survey, measuring like similar perception of regulation like ours, I would love to compare how our index is co-moved with those survey-based measures. Yeah, I'm not aware of well, David, you mentioned the Gallup data. I'm not super familiar with that. And does that measure like regulatory sentiment or similar metrics?
It's about Nir knows better because he's analyzing it closely, but it's about support or a poor trust in regulation as well. Support or
Okay.
trust in regulation. Nir, do you
Yeah.
want to comment?
Yeah, so it's a very simple measure. I mean, the Gallup one, there are others as well, but the Gallup one actually just asks about trust in business regulation or something like that in very, very unsensitive ways. So whether you support, you do not support, or somewhere between.
I see.
Um,
Yeah.
The advantage of the Gallup data, it's the limitation is that it's mostly US, but it's long time. It's decade long. But there are other surveys as well, which are less frequent but cross-national. I see Marcus is raising his hand, but before, can you please tell us what you can see? How does the Wall Street Journal say? Different from the New York Times, and how do the news sections differ from editorial essays, public kind of editorial opinions pages?
Yeah. So let me start with the second one. We didn't differentiate between like news or opinions or like those different types of articles in the news source. But what we used is the articles classified as news in the ProQuest database. So there might still be some opinion pieces classified as news, accidentally there, but this is the best we could do. And for different newspapers, we actually also did a robustness check by constructing indexes for individual newspapers. So we constructed like 7 different indexes for each of the newspapers. And we did see some variations among those indexes, but the first principal component of all those 7 indexes is highly correlated with our baseline index, which is estimated using the fixed effects regressions. So it at least suggests that the aggregate, our baseline index is capturing, kind of the aggregate measure. And
so it's surprising that the gaps between, say, right and left or liberal conservatives is not coming into the analysis so forcefully. So there is kind of even in the last 4 decades, really, you have almost 3 to 4 decades. You don't capture the gaps, the extreme kind of political extremism in the state regarding regulation.
There are definitely differences in the ideological stances among those newspapers, and I mean you could see that variations in the indexes constructed based on individual newspapers. But I guess our purpose here, our objective is to capture, the prevalent views about regulation, regardless of the ideological stances of individual newspapers. Yeah.
Okay, so it's Marcus now.
We have another question from Marcus. Please, Marcus.
Thank you very much. It was most interesting. I wanted to ask you, what struck me as strange was finance came out as the most prominent source of materials.
Mhm.
I wonder if that has anything to do with the choice of newspapers. Because I mean, I find that surprising. I would have expected other things to come up with the most frequent mention rather than, I mean, I realize that finance covers everything, banking, shares,
Yeah.
stocks and shares and everything like that. But still, it strikes me as being, during the period you did it, a little bit kind of over biased towards that area. I also wonder, I know it's very difficult to do, but I wondered if you had thought about including social media in any way in your analysis, because I wonder if it would remain the same if you looked at the different sources of social media.
Mhm.
I think it would be very interesting to see how much the real press is different from what goes on in social media. The other thing I wanted to ask you was, did you find, I don't know if you did this, but were any of these topics that were being discussed? Because I looked at your graphs, and you know when there was a lot of activity in things like COVID or 9/11, 9/11 actually was quite low according to what you were showing there. And the one before that, there was one major spike as well before that. Um, I wondered if there's any influence on what's going on round about, for example, lobbyists, people pushing certain kinds of viewpoints in order to change or impact the regulation. If you find there was anything in that kind of, I realize these are kind of going off on a tangent, but it's interesting to me if these things actually impacted in any way what we're doing.
Yeah. So let me start with your first. Yeah, first of all, thank you for your thoughts. I think there are many great ideas. On the prevalence of financial and banking regulation in newspapers, I didn't think it was very surprising because those type of regulations affect people usually see more direct relationship connection between financial and banking regulations and economic activity, and they talk a lot about that. We didn't look at how the prevalence of different areas would change for individual newspapers. I can definitely do that. I would probably think maybe the Wall Street Journal tend to talk more about financial and banking regulations, but the other newspapers should be more balanced. Yeah, but I can definitely look into this. And social media, yeah, I think that would be another interesting paper to measure this kind of perception of regulation using social media as data. I think that would be a different angle. And it would be interesting to compare that with our measures. And on your comment about whether that also capturing like lobbying activities, I think it would definitely do if those activities are also discussed extensively in newspapers. And as I mentioned, our measure did not only capture what have actually changed in the regulatory regime, but also like a lot of discussions about like what might happen in the regulatory regime, and also like people's comment about current or of like potential regulatory changes. So, for example, after the 9/11 event, there was a lot of blame for the regulation of Homeland Security, and then there are like a lot of movements after that, which also created the Department of Homeland Security. So that kind of like blame, like complaints about regulation, was also captured in the news. That's why we saw a large drop in regulatory sentiment around that area. So that's my understanding. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have 4 minutes more, so I'll take the liberty to ask two quick questions. One of them is about putting together sentiment and uncertainty. So it was not clear to me whether they conceptually link together, whether it's a framing decision or not. So if you could please say a few words about this. And the other thing was about the negativity of the overall sentiments of regulation. And I was interested because there is a negativity bias in media in general. So is regulation differ from other concepts, other issues, from the general level of sentiment, or not? So it would be very interesting for me to hear your take on that.
Just wanted to clarify your first question. Did you ask whether like uncertainty and sentiment is correlated?
No. Conceptually, when you define them, do we need to discuss about uncertainty and sentiment together? Is it related? I mean, as a phenomenon, general or not?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I think part of the sentiment is definitely affected by uncertainty, but they do not completely co-move together. As I mentioned in the presentation, like the example of 2016 presidential election, we did see both increases in regulatory sentiment and uncertainty. So although uncertainty is generally perceived negatively, what we saw from the data is that they do not necessarily like co-move. Like that is not necessarily the case. Like high level of uncertainty is not necessarily co-move with like negative uncertainty. They could increase at the same time. So I think they are conceptually different, although there may be some overlap. That's my short answer. We did in our econometric analysis, we did some robustness check by introducing an interaction term of regulatory sentiment and regulatory uncertainty into the regression to see does the effects of regulatory sentiment differ when there are different levels of uncertainty. So we generally find that the negative effects of regulatory sentiment tend to be larger if the uncertainty is larger, but the difference is not statistically significant. So we did not draw a very strong conclusion from that. So on your second question, now I kind of lost my track. Did you ask the next? So you say the media is usually biased and tend to like
usually negative.
Yeah, usually negative. Yeah, that's possible. I mean, but I think an important note is that our measure captures the fluctuations, the changes over time. So it matters less if the absolute sentiment is negative or positive because we care about how they changed over time. That's what our index captures. So it could be true that the absolute sentiment score is always negative, but it does not affect
the general fluctuations. Would them be different than specific attention on regulation? That's what I'm asking.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
So I'm asking if you're of course you are interested in the trends over time, and I'm asking whether those changes that you capture would be different from the overall fluctuations and trends of negativity in media in general. That's what I'm asking.
Oh, I see. Yes. I think that could definitely be different as since in our approach, we focused on very specific news content related to regulation, like those specific regulatory sections. That is because we want to exclude the other content that maybe talk about economic conditions or other economic activity. That and the sentiment expressed about the overall economic conditions could be different from the sentiment expressed about regulation. Yeah, and in our econometric analysis, when we study how regulatory sentiment or regulatory uncertainty affects macroeconomic outcomes, we also controlled for several existing measures of economic sentiment to make sure that those do not, drive the relationship there.
I think we are running out of time, so I will say again, thank you, Zoey, for this great presentation and focus on this issue. We're looking forward to see the outputs of your project, and until then, I will say good evening, good morning to each of you, and see you next time.
Yeah. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Nir and David, for hosting this.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.